whenever you have a question. All right, thank you all for joining me. This is Psych 92, Developmental Psychology, the review for Midterm 1. Again, I do encourage you to unmute and ask questions if there are any things I say that you would like further clarification on. So first of all, we're going to go over Chapter 1. Assumptions of development are really important for you to know, and there are 6 assumptions. Development is lifelong, meaning we don't just stop when we're many classes, for instance, end at adolescence. And sometimes people make the assumption that once somebody is an adolescent, becomes an adult, that's it. There's no more changes, when actually changes happen to us all the way up through death. So development is lifelong. Development is multi-directional. This one, so many students have a misunderstanding, and so I want to, again, make it clear. When I say multi-directional, I'm talking about concurrent gain and loss. For example, when babies learn how to walk and they gain control over their bodily movements, they lose the speed of their reflexes. So it's concurrent. So to say that, as a child, I'm growing up, and then when I'm a senior citizen, I'm going to shrink, that is not multi-directional development, that is concurrent. Yes, we're talking about a gain and loss, but it's not happening at the same time. So if you have a question that asks you to give an example of multi-directional development, then it needs to be at the same time. Another example would be, let's say you get married, right? You gain a spouse, you gain a legal partner, you likely lose connection with your parents. So whenever you think of examples of development being multi-directional, it's important that you think about it in a concurrent way. In other words, happening at the same time. Any questions about this one so far? All right, development is multidimensional. Hopefully you see that we are talking about 3 main dimensions. We talk about the physical domain, the cognitive domain, and the socio-emotional domain. So when we talk about development being multidimensional, the change is happening, even though we arbitrarily have separated them into these different domains, they're happening all at the same time. Most of the time, you'll see that we start off with physical development because it's changes in the physical structure of our brain that will then cause change in the cognitive component, in the way we think, right? So physical domain pertains to actual structures, physical structures in our bodies that are changing. The cognitive domain has to do with our thinking processes, our memory, our attention, those kind of components. So when our brains are developing, obviously that's going to impact the way we're thinking. And the way we think also impacts the way we interact with others. So that's why when we talk about development being multidimensional, it's happening in these domains at the same time. Development is multidisciplinary. Although we're looking at this from a psychological perspective, there are many other disciplines that are interested in looking at how humans change over time. So there's interest in development from a biological perspective or biochemical perspective, maybe even neurological. So there are many different disciplines that are looking at the way people change over time, not only psychology. Development is characterized by plasticity. So when we're talking about plasticity here, we're not talking about...
Can I ask a question real quick?
Sure.
So when you say multidisciplinary, can you elaborate on that a little bit more? I was a little confused because I understood it more in the sense of like humans are constantly learning new disciplines in a way, like math and English, but I'm not sure if that's where I should have gone with that.
No, it's not actually. So when we're talking about development is multidisciplinary, there are different disciplines that are interested in the way humans change over time.
I see.
So
So it's like multiple different disciplines that are studying the same thing, but in different ways.
exactly, you
Okay.
got it. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions? Okay. So development is characterized by plasticity. We are not talking about toys and plastic things or, things that we're now finding are in our bodies. When I talk about plasticity, I'm talking about adaptability and resilience. that when something major happens, like for instance, somebody loses a limb, the younger people are, the more likely it is that their brains can rewire to make up for that loss of the limb. Even if it's your dominant hand, you'll find that the brain's going to change and then shift that dexterity to the non-dominant hand that's left behind. So that's one example. Plasticity really refers to our adaptability to things that are happening to us. And I think it's a very powerful thing that humans have, right? So development is lifelong, doesn't change or stop at childhood. Multi-directional, gain and loss at the same time. Multi-dimensional, happening in physical, cognitive, and socio-emotional domains at the same time. Multidisciplinary, meaning many different disciplines are interested in the way humans change. And plasticity refers to the resilience that we have in terms of being able to overcome challenges. And then multi-contextual. You just covered the first 3 chapters, so you might not see it yet, but in the first chapter, it talked about different contexts. And you'll learn that context really has a huge influence on the way people change as they grow older. And so that development, when you're, at home and you learn new things, hopefully you're not just leaving it at home and you're taking it to school and vice versa. So we have different contexts. We have the home environment, the school environment, we have religion, we have culture, we have socioeconomic status. All of these different contexts are influencing the way we change over time. And so when we talk about development being multi-contextual, it's not only one aspect that influences how we change, it's many different components of our life. Any questions about these 6 assumptions of development? Oh,
Can you give another example of multidisciplinary?
Well, so we have biological, biochemical, physiological, we might have neurological, we have psychological, we have sociological. So these are all different disciplines, and they all look at human development. I'm not sure what other way we can talk about it. Like, so experts from these different fields of study would be looking at how people change. So for psychology, right, we are looking at the ABC. Psychology pertains to anything with affect or the way we feel, behavior or the way we act, and cognition or the way we think. So it's very focused on the ABCs of psychology. On the other hand, a sociologist might look at how people are changing in terms of their interaction in large groups, right? Because sociology has to do with the way large groups of people behave. Psychology has to do with how individuals are behaving. And then a neurologist who's looking at somebody as, they grow over time would be interested in the functioning of their neural system. So all of this together gives us a greater understanding of how people change over time. Psychology specifically is only looking at individual change over time in those components, in the affect, behavior, and cognition. Does that help, hopefully?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay. So when we talk about development being multi-contextual, here are examples of some contexts. So normative age graded. That's a fancy way of talking about developmental stages, right? We talk about infancy and toddlerhood, early childhood, middle and late childhood, adolescence. Those are all developmental stages. When we talk about normative age graded, we are looking at typical development that happens in these different stages. That's what age graded means. So by the time somebody's 2 years old, we expect them to be able to do certain things. That's what we mean by age graded. Normative history graded, on the other hand, that pertains to different how the context of what's happening outside of the person is affecting it. So this is where we're talking about generations. For example, we talk about millennials or Zoomers or baby boomers or Gen X. That's because things that happen outside in the world, social events, they impact how people develop as well. So when you combine the history graded context with the age graded context, that really gives us more information about the people. So another example I can give you is kids who were growing up during COVID, right? Babies who were born during the shelter in place. What did they see the first 2 years? People with masks on. So we don't know yet what's going to happen to these kids. Are they better at reading, eye expressions than people who, were used to seeing the entire facial expression? What we are finding out is some of them have some delays in terms of social interaction that hopefully they'll be able to overcome it, right? But that's an example of how normative age graded is combining with the normative history graded context. So the younger people were, when that shelter in place happened, the more affected there were, right? Older people, yes, it was painful for us to be, not be able to interact and have to wear masks and all that. But it's really the younger ones who were more impacted by that shelter in place. Non-normative. So non-normative, this class focuses more on normative or typical development, but we have non-normative circumstances as well that's going to impact. An example is like losing your parents at a young age, a very young age. Thankfully, that is not a typical occurrence. And so we recognize that these non-normative instances are going to impact how somebody develops over time. Another context is socioeconomic status. We know that it's not that being rich makes you a better person, but we do know that people who have, a certain level of income have more options, are able to do certain things like travel or things like that, that people who don't have that monetary income have, and that does impact people's development as well. And then another big one is culture. So when we talk about culture, hopefully you saw in chapter 2 that culture really impacts people even before they're born. Why? Because babies, as they're developing their mother's uterus, can hear the language that mom is speaking. They can actually taste the food that mom is eating. And so that is also going to, when the baby's out in the world, that's going to impact their preferences, right? We know that babies have a preference for the language they hear while they are in the womb. We know that babies have a preference for the taste of food right when they started, right? Because when mom is ingesting these things, they actually have a sense of that taste as well. So culture is hugely impactful on development. Two terms you need to know. Ethnocentrism, you can break it down. Ethno, like ethnic, and centrism, it's like your focus. So when you have an ethnocentric perspective, you believe your culture is better than everybody else's, right? For an example, if you go to another country, if you have an ethnocentric perspective and you go to another country, you're constantly looking at the differences in a negative way. Like, what's wrong with these people? Why don't they have XYZ, unlike, in the US? That's an ethnocentric perspective. Cultural relativity, on the other hand, is when you recognize that different cultures have different practices, different food, different things that they're doing. And instead of looking at those differences as a deficit, you're looking at them with appreciation, with greater understanding. You look at the historical reasons that things are the way they are. And so you're not expecting everything to be the same as your ethnicity or your culture. You're respecting the differences and not viewing them as negative. Any questions about this page?
So should we expect to, let's just say for the final, is the context of development going to be focused more on the culture as a whole, or should we expect to be more focused on the differences between ethnocentrism and cultural relativity?
I'm not sure what you mean by focuses. So there might be a question where you'd have to give an example of
Okay.
ethnocentrism or cultural relativity, or there might be a multiple choice question giving you a scenario, and then you have to indicate, is this person being ethnocentric or culturally relativistic? You know what I mean?
I
That's more.
see. I was just wondering if it would be more focused on the, like, how to put this, like, oh, how does culture affect the development stage, or if it would be more on the sense of examples, but that makes more sense. Thank you.
Okay, so other terms to remember, and this was from the homework, right? There were different types of age. We are used to stating our chronological age, well, some of us, and that's really from the day you're born up to today, chronological age. Biological age has to do with our physiological functioning. So think about people who you think, oh, wow, I didn't realize they were this age. They seem so much younger, or they seem so much older. What we're usually referring to is their biological age. How do they appear? How is their skin? How is their, um, their hair, all of these components? Those are things that we kind of look at in terms of determining someone's biological age. Psychological age, on the other hand, has to do with one's maturity, right? Like if you have somebody who is in their 50s and they go to a party and they don't feel comfortable, they don't want to talk to anybody. Maybe it's because psychologically they are younger, not quite matured yet. And that has to do with experiences in many cases. And then social age has to do with expectations we have of people. So social age in many ways is culturally relative, right? Because in some cultures, maybe it's expected that, people who are in their 20s are already married, right? That's a social expectation. And then they might view it that if they're not married already, then, oh, what people, right? That kind of idea. So social age, among all of the different types of age, is the one that is most impacted by one's culture because we're talking about social expectations. Any questions about types of age? Okay, issues of development. So when we are researching developmental psychology, we can really categorize the different types of studies into these different issues of development. So sources of development, we're talking about nature versus nurture. Why is it that people are the way they are? Is it purely genetic, in which case it's nature? Or does it have to do with how they were raised, in which case we're talking about nurture? What we know is it's an interaction, right? We know that actually both impact people's development. But when somebody's conducting a research study, you might look and see, oh, okay, if they're talking about the impact of some kind of intervention on cognition, then we're looking at sources of development. Plasticity, again, we're talking about resilience, ability to overcome challenges or changes. Continuity versus discontinuity. So this really has to do with theories, right? A continuous perspective means that we believe people change gradually and slowly over time. A discontinuous perspective, on the other hand, we believe that the changes happen in a qualitative way and abruptly, and that's why you have stages. So if you have a theory that talks about stages, then that has a discontinuous perspective. So Erikson's stages of psychosocial development, because there are stages, we know it's discontinuous. Piaget's stages of cognitive development, we know that that is discontinuous. On the other hand, Vygotsky, who we also are looking at in terms of cognitive development, he doesn't talk about stages. So Vygotsky's perspective of cognitive development is more continuous. Vygotsky, remember, was emphasizing how children's interaction with others, it was a socio-cultural perspective. Interaction with others, more learned others, really helped their cognitive development. So he didn't believe that children's ability to think and pay attention and remember things, he didn't believe that happened because of major changes from one age to another. He believed that happened more organically through interaction with others. And that's why socio-cultural is his perspective. So remember that if you're looking, and you are responsible for different theories, right? And I'll list them at the end. Consider if there is mention of stages, then that's discontinuous. If there's no mention of stages, then it's very likely it is a continuous perspective. And then the last one is individual differences. What is it that, for instance, we talked about COVID, right? Like, why is it that some people really were affected negatively by what happened during COVID or by the vaccines, and others just, got over it very quickly. So these are issues of individual differences. We are interested in knowing because you should never paint any group of people with the same brush, right? There are always going to be individual differences. What is causing those individual differences? So that's an issue of development that many researchers are interested in. Any questions about this page? No? Okay. So here is a list of the normative age-graded context, periods of development. So for next Sunday, I believe, this coming Sunday, you're going to have to tell me which stage of development you're going to write about in your research paper. And it's got to be something that you remember. And so it's not going to be prenatal, and it won't be infancy and toddlerhood because of infant amnesia. So it's likely going to be anywhere from early childhood up through whatever stage you're in now. And I'm guessing most of you are either in early adulthood or middle adulthood. So one of these stages, one of these periods of development is what you're going to choose. And then you're going to choose two contexts. Remember, we talked about these different contexts. Two contexts and how they impacted your development in the different domains. So it could be, how did the home context impact you physically, cognitively, socio-emotionally? How did your culture impact you physically, cognitively, socio-emotionally? That's what your paper is going to be about. So this is the different periods of development, or otherwise known as the normative age-graded context. Any questions about this one? All right. Here are domains. So really there are 4 domains, but in this class, we combine the socio-emotional components. We have physical, as I mentioned before, cognitive, and emotional and social, and language is another one, but we just put socio-emotional together. And we only talk about language in the early childhood component. Context, I mentioned this before, we have a lot of different contexts. So you're just going to choose 2 of them and let me know how you think that impacted you in terms of your development in that particular stage. So neighborhood, family, time, media, school, culture, socioeconomic status, friends is another one, media, we're talking about social media. So there are different contexts that you can choose. The key is that you're going to have some empirical articles to back up what you're saying in terms of how they impacted you. So that's why it becomes a research paper, because you're going to look at some research scholarly articles and let me know, use those, cite those to support whatever you say about the changes that you're experiencing. Any questions? Okay, so I'm going to have some sample multiple choice questions. Feel free to speak out loud and give me your guess. Okay, here we go. All right, Drax was concerned about whether his unborn child would have sickle cell anemia. Drax is really concerned about the child's genotype, phenotype, plasticity, or canalization. You can unmute and give your guess.
Genotype?
Very good. So we're talking about genotype because we're not talking about some kind of physical component that they're looking at. We're talking about here, he's worried about an illness that they're going to have. All right, in the blank period, the zygote becomes a blastocyst because of the process called blank. So yes, there are some questions that have 2 blanks. What you do is just focus on one of them, and you can use process of elimination, right? So in the blank period, the zygote becomes a blastocyst. Okay, which period of development talks about zygotes? Is it the embryonic or germinal? See, there are only 2 choices for the first one. So that's what you would focus on. And then, is it mitosis or meiosis? Anybody have a guess on which one is the correct answer? In the blank period, the zygote becomes a blastocyst because of the process called
A, embryonic and mitosis.
That's a good guess, but actually B. So I'll tell you why. Embryonic is the second stage. Germinal is the stage that happens right after conception. So it's only in the germinal stage that we call it a zygote, right? That's and then it's mitosis. You are correct, mitosis, because it's growth, right? Remember that the only time we use meiosis is to produce the sperm or egg cell. Any other kind of cell growth is from mitosis. So just make sure you have a good sense of what it's called at the different stages. So for zygote, that is the germinal period, right? We don't call it a fetus until in the fetal stage. It's an embryo afterwards. So when we talk about the zygote, if you hear zygote, you know it's germinal stage. We talk about embryo, it's the embryonic stage. Any questions about this one? Okay. Peter Quill was born with only one kidney. Based on your understanding of critical periods in prenatal development, when was his mother likely to have been exposed to a teratogen? Was it in the embryonic period, the germinal period, the fetal period, or a gestational period?
Embryonic?
Yes, that is correct. So remember, that is actually the period of prenatal development that is extremely critical in terms of organ development. So remember, there was a chart in the slides, it's also in the textbook, that shows the different stages of development. So if it is in the germinal period and the mom's exposed to teratogen, it's very likely it will end in a miscarriage. However, in the embryonic period, that's when you're going to see a lot of potential issues with the organ development. And then in the fetal period, it's more likely that it'll be things like fingers and toes and legs and more external components. Any questions about this? All right. In comparison to an adult body, an infant's head is blank, disproportionately large, disproportionately small, completely proportionate to an adult, or none of the answers are correct.
Disproportionately large?
Yes, that is correct. So if you remember, there is a picture when babies are born, their heads are pretty close to like a third of their bodies, whereas as an adult, it's more like a fifth or a sixth. So yes, the infant's head is disproportionately large in comparison to their body. In the process of myelination, the brain develops thousands of neurons, the brain forms thousands of synapses, the brain cleans out unused synapses, or the brain forms an insulating covering on axons. What happens in myelination?
D?
Yes, that is correct. So remember, myelination happens throughout our lives, but especially for infants, you do not want to put them on a diet, right? Because the myelin sheath is actually a fatty substance, and they do need fat in their diets in order to have proper myelination. The reason it's important is because it's like insulation. If any of you are good with electricity, when you insulate the wire, it makes the electrons move more quickly through the wire. And guess what? Our brains are electrical in nature. And so when we have the neurons have the axons have the myelin sheath on it, it actually increases our processing speed. So it's a really good thing. And that's the white matter in our brains. Any questions? Okay. Kicking a soccer ball is an example of blank, while drawing a cartoon is an example of blank. So which one's a large motor skill? Which one's a small motor skill?
B?
Correct. So large, kicking a soccer ball, large motor skills have to do with things you do with your arms and legs. So throwing and kicking, punching, those things are large motor skills. Small motor skills really have to do with the dexterity of your hand. And that's why drawing a cartoon is an example of a small motor skill. Printing or cursive, those kind of things are small motor skills as well. Any questions about large or small motor skills? So there is a page in your textbook that kind of breaks down different abilities based on age. You want to make sure that you have a good understanding of what is the difference between something a 2-year-old can do as opposed to a 4-year-old, right? Because that is part of the learning objective. When Zatanna looked for her top hat in a dark room, she found it using her blank lobe more than her blank lobe. So 2 different lobes. Remember, you need to know what are the functions of the different lobes of the brain. So did she use her frontal lobe more than her parietal lobe? The occipital lobe more than the temporal lobe? The parietal lobe more than the occipital lobe, or the temporal lobe more than the frontal lobe? So you have to remember what are the different lobes used for in our brains.
Is it C?
You're correct. Excellent. Yes. So the reason it is C is because of the phrase there, in a dark room. So in a dark room, you're not going to be using your eyesight very much. The occipital lobe has to do with your sight. The parietal lobe, on the other hand, has to do with your spatial awareness. And so if you're in a dark room, you need to have spatial awareness more than you need to have vision. Any questions about this one? Excuse me. Okay. Baby coriander sticks out her tongue when her father sticks out his. This requires coriander to have, is it proprioception, visual acuity, habituation, or preferential looking? What does the baby need to have in order to look at her dad and be able to mimic that action?
Proprioception.
Anybody?
Is it proprioception?
Yes, it is. So proprioception is your ability, your awareness of where your body is and how to move those parts of your body. So it's fascinating because no one teaches babies how to do that. They just know it innately. And when they look at other people, that they can automatically translate whatever they're seeing into a bodily movement in their own. And that's really fascinating. It's a great, and it's an important skill. Piaget believed that children learn best when they have consistent opportunities to explore their environment. This demonstrates an active construction of understanding, a passive construction of understanding, evolutionary construction of understanding, or none of these actions or none of these answers are correct.
A.
Yes, just as I did it. It is an active construction of understanding. Why? Because the children, in Piaget's perspective, children are not waiting for people to teach them. You put them in a safe environment with, stimulating objects around, and they're just going to go for it. That's active. That means that they are innately motivated to learn about their environment. Passive construction means that they're waiting for somebody else to give them the information, right? And then evolutionary is something I just made up. So when we're talking about active, just like the active genotype environment correlation, it's that there's something within the child, within the person that motivates them to go seek out these experiences. That is what we mean by active. Any questions about this one?
Was there a person who taught the passive construction of understanding that we have to reference?
Yes, so passive would be, for example, the tabula rasa example, like the blank slate. Rousseau's idea that kids were born as a blank slate, that parents just kind of almost scribe or project everything they want onto their children. That would be passive. That's an example of a passive understanding or passive construction. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
All right, when we feel uncomfortable with a situation we have never faced before, The discomfort is caused by the state called, is it accommodation, assimilation, equilibrium, or disequilibrium?
D.
Yes, it is D. Important to remember, this is also part of your homework, right? So remember, in terms of Piaget, he believed that children creative or constructed schemas. A schema is their understanding of the world. And so if they come up to a situation that is easily explained by their existing schema, then they just accommodate it. It's like, oh, great. Okay, now I know that, for example, the example I gave is Santa Claus, right? If a child constructs that, oh, yes, there's a Santa Claus that happens at Christmas time, and mom takes the kid to a mall and sees the Santa Claus, that fits in with their existing schema, so they accommodate it. On the other hand, let's say mom and the kid go to another mall and there's another Santa and it looks different. He looks different from the Santa they just saw. And he's like, wait a minute, I thought there's only one Santa. So now the child's schema does not explain this experience. That inability to explain the experience is called disequilibrium. So when a child has a schema that explains everything in the world, it makes them happy, they're content, and they are in a state of equilibrium or balance. But when they have an experience that is not explained by the existing schema, it bothers them. And that is called disequilibrium. And when people experience disequilibrium, they're motivated to learn why the schema doesn't work. So they might ask their parent, they might ask their friends, or they might even construct an explanation in their heads. But the point is that when they have an experience that does not fit their schemas, that does not fit their understanding of the world, there is a discomfort that happens, and that's the disequilibrium. Any questions about these terms? All right. Oh, I kind of gave you this answer already. When we walk into a classroom and expect the professor to be waiting at the front ready to teach us, it is one of our schemas, shawarma schemes, or schedules.
Schemas.
Correct. And I kind of explained that already. All right. Daddy Clark likes to put his finger in the palm of baby Bruce's hand to see him grab it. This is an example of the blank substage of Piaget's sensory motor stage. Is it a primary circular reaction, a secondary circular reaction? It's an example of reflexes or the beginning of representational thought.
C.
It is, oops, why isn't it working? Yes, it is C. It's an example of a reflex, right? It's a grasping reflex. So there are multiple reflexes that we talk about in the textbook and in the slides. And the idea is that really some of them we understand why they are there. For example, the grasping reflex, the rooting reflex, that seems to be an evolutionary adaptation that for survival, right? Rooting, sucking, all of these things help babies find food. Others, we don't know what the purpose is. Like the Moro reflex where they just kind of splay out, we don't know what that purpose is. Why do doctors test reflexes? Well, if a baby doesn't exhibit a reflex, it could be indicative of a neurological problem. And so that's why it's really important for doctors to check reflexes, even if we don't fully understand what some of them, what the purpose is for some of them. Any questions about reflexes? Okay. John is 32 and having more trouble learning English than his 12-year-old sister, Shaira. This is likely because he has passed the blank of language development. Is it cognitive period, sensitive period, plastic period, or potential period?
Is it B?
Correct, it is B, sensitive period. So what we do know is that the primary language development has a critical period, meaning once you pass that stage, you cannot gain that skill. So primary language development has to happen by the time somebody is 12. Secondary language acquisition, on the other hand, has a sensitive period. So sensitive period means that it's a time that is easier or more likely for people to get that skill, but it's not impossible to do after the sensitive period has happened. So it's great that secondary language development only has a sensitive period, because that's why people, my age, can still try to learn a new language. If it was a critical period for secondary language acquisition, then I would never be able to learn another language. And so that's what the difference is with sensitive period and critical period. That's something hopefully you can all understand. Any questions about that? All right. When we studied root words in English class, such as the meanings of prefixes like un and dis, we were learning about the blank of language. So this is the only chapter in which we talk about language in this detail. And it's because kids are learning how to speak. So are they phonemes, morphemes, syntax, or pragmatics? Learning the meaning of prefixes like un and dis.
C.
Oops, correct. It's morpheme. So if just a recap of it, a phoneme are the smallest unit of sound. So it would be like l, e, t, let, right? So those are the phonemes. Morphemes, on the other hand, are the smallest units of meaning. And that's why we talk about prefixes and suffixes, because when you add the un, it actually makes it the opposite. If you talk about something breakable and you add the un on it, unbreakable, then that means it's no longer breakable. So prefixes and suffixes are small units of language that change the meaning of a word, right? And then we talk about syntax, and that's sort of like the rules in which language is structured. That's what we mean by syntax. And then pragmatics is just like, how are we studying the words? What is the practical use of the way that we're using words in a language? Okay, baby Parker reacts negatively to new situations, has trouble adapting to routine, and is usually negative in mood. In Chess and Thomas's system for classifying infant temperaments, baby Parker would be considered what? Difficult, easy, slow to warm up, or canalized?
Difficult.
Oops, correct. So if we had a spectrum, we have easy on one end and difficult on the other, and it's slow to warm up in the middle. So based on temperament, remember, is something that we believe is biologically based. So babies who have are easily in a routine, who have predictable sleep-wake schedules, feeding schedules, and even, pooing and peeing schedules, like that makes them easy. Difficult, on the other hand, are the ones who are extremely unpredictable and hard to manage from a parental perspective. And then slow to warm up is right in the middle. So those are the different types of temperament, which is kind of starts the basis of personality as people get older. Any questions about the infant temperaments? Okay. Natasha is 18 months old and clings to her mother every time a new person approaches them. This is called separation anxiety, stranger wariness, social referencing, or emotional self-regulation. What is that?
Stranger awareness.
Correct. Stranger awareness. So separation anxiety is when Natasha just doesn't, starts crying when mom goes away. Stranger awareness is taking a look, eyeballing the strangers. So that doesn't happen until about 6 months, actually. Social referencing is when a baby will look at the caregiver or their trusted person And C, the baby literally observes the interaction between their caregiver and the stranger and will base their own reaction on what they see their caregiver do. So that's that's a type of maturity, if you think about it, like a social understanding of how people are interacting. And then emotional self-regulation has to do with things like delayed gratification or response inhibition, right? Like those are things where people can actually stop themselves, stop an impulse, stop an action while in the midst of doing it, or stop it even before it happens, or choose to delay a reward for a greater reward later. Those are examples of emotional self-regulation. Any questions about this one? Okay, so those are kind of a taste of the types of multiple choice questions I ask. Remember that the format of the exam is multiple choice, matching, and short answer. I believe there are 25 multiple choice questions of 5 points, or one question worth 5 points for matching, and the rest are short answer. So short answer and matching, these are the topics that will be presented to you. Developmental theories. So these are the ones you should know enough about them that you can distinguish them from each other. Behaviorist, constructivist, evolutionary, information processing, psychodynamic, social learning, sociocultural, and systems. So behaviorist, we're talking about that whole operant conditioning, classical conditioning. Remember that behaviorism happened as a response to psychodynamic. So psychodynamic perspective really looked at lifelong experiences, talked about introspection, people thinking about their experiences and what's happening. Behavior said, you know what? It's really hard to measure what people think. So we can only measure what people are doing. We only should look at behaviors. That's why they're called behaviorists. And so classical conditioning is a way of modifying behavior. It's matching or pairing an unconditioned stimulus with a conditioned stimulus. So an unconditioned stimulus is something that evokes a response from us, and it's something that's innate. We don't have to be trained. For example, salivating at food that we like. That's an unconditioned response, right? On the other hand, a bell doesn't necessarily do anything for us. But when you pair food that we like with the sound of a bell 2 or 3 times, guess what? That pairing can condition us to salivate at the sound of the bell, which is what happened to Pavlov's dogs, right? So that's classical conditioning, has to do with pairing. Operant conditioning has to do with consequences, rewards, and punishments. Again, we can modify people's behaviors based on whether we give them punishments for things that we don't want them to repeat or rewards for behaviors that we do want them to repeat. So that's the kind of behaviorist component. Constructivist, on the other hand, we kind of talked about this before, is the belief that people innately want to learn about the world, right? They want to understand the world and they create their own understanding. That is constructivist. Piaget is a constructivist. Evolutionary, we believe that changes are happening as a result of a way of helping our species to either get food more easily or to reproduce more easily. It's all about species survival. That's what evolutionary perspective. Information processing perspective kind of makes this analogy of our brains to a computer, right? So information processing, usually that has to do with cognitive development. And it talks about things like input. So what are our input mechanisms? Well, our eyes, our taste. So the different senses, that's an input. Those are our sensory receptors are a form of input. What is output? Well, it's our behaviors, things like that. And so with the information processing, it's kind of how they explain somebody's intelligence or memory in a way that's very similar to computers, how computers work. Psychodynamic, Freud is the greatest example of the psychodynamic perspective, where the belief is that people have unconscious motives that are based on experiences they had as children, and that leads them to certain adult behaviors. That's really the psychodynamic perspective. Social learning perspective, that is Bandura. So Bandura believed that children learn by observing others. So there were three components to social learning perspective. There's modeling. So when people are behaving a certain way, with the understanding that others will watch them, that's modeling, right? Then there's imitation. That's when other people replicate what they see people do. And then there's differential reinforcement. So social learning is very much linked to the behaviorist component, because differential reinforcement is kind of like punishment or reward. So an example, if a little boy sees his mom carrying a baby and he picks up a doll and carries the baby the same way, right? So the mom carrying the baby is modeling. The little boy picking up the doll is imitation. Now, how mom responds to the little boy playing with the doll is the differential reinforcement. If the mom smiles and says, "Oh my gosh, you're so cute," then the little boy's going to feel like, "Hey, this is a good thing," and will continue to do that. That's the reward is mom's positive reaction. On the other hand, if mom says, "What are you doing? Boys don't play with dolls," then the boy's gonna, that's like a punishment to the boy, and he will not likely repeat that behavior. Now, on the other hand, if mom does that, something different with a daughter, if she says that's cute, that differential reinforcement part, right? So that's what social learning is about. Is it involves modeling, imitation, and differential reinforcement. And there are other components, but that's one main part. Sociocultural is Vygotsky's, right? So social learning is Ventura. Sociocultural is Vygotsky's perspective, and that has to do, as I mentioned before, with sort of the impact of our social interactions in the cultural context with how people are learning, right? So that is that the more kids are interacting with more learned others, the greater they're going to learn. And then the systems approach, that's Bronfenbrenner's, which is a continuous perspective because it doesn't talk about stages, right? It talks about how the environmental context, including ones that we might not even be aware of, how they impact us. So remember that we had those different systems, the microsystems, the mesosystems, right? Like all those different systems, that even something as far off as politics can impact a little baby, right? So that's the idea with the systems perspective. So know enough about those that you can distinguish from each other. The whole issues of development is also something I explained earlier about continuity, discontinuity, individual differences, plasticity, and sources of development, which is a nature-nurture component. The 6 components of lifespan perspective. So in the study guide, I kind of gave you examples of what kinds of questions could happen with a short answer. So make sure you take a look at that. The other part could be research designs, and I have that on the next slide, or also attachment theories. So Freud's idea of that the reason babies are attached to their moms is because mom feeds them, nurses them, right? Harlow's study, that was the monkey study. So understand which one did Harlow's monkey study support? Was it Freud's theory or Bowlby's theory? So Bowlby's theory was that the reason that babies are attached to their moms is because mom gives them a safe place. Mom provides comfort, not necessarily food, right? So there are different nuances there in terms of what Freud emphasized and what Bowlby emphasized. And so you should watch the monkey study and see which one was supported. Any questions about the short answer or matching component? Okay, so then the last page is here, the research methods. Different research methods that we use in developmental psychology. Basic is just research that people are conducting just to learn more about the human condition. Applied research is when the research is conducted to solve a problem, right? So if the research is being done to know how can we increase the number of students who pass this certain test, that's applied research, right? Why do babies like the color red? That's basic research. You're not trying to solve a problem. You just want to learn more about how people are. Action research is a type of applied research that is used for determining policies, right? So if a school district wants to pass a policy that every child is going to be given an iPad, they might conduct studies on, random studies on certain grades to see if it improves their outcomes. That's an example of action research. It's solving a specific problem that is going to be going to have some kind of law or policy based on the outcomes. Types of research methods, usually we look at observation, correlation, or experiments. Observations are qualitative studies where they're looking at kids. It could be something where they bring them into a lab, in which case it's a laboratory observation, or they might just observe kids in their environment like a playground or a classroom, in which case it's a naturalistic observation. Correlations usually are surveys where you are looking at the relationship between two variables and seeing if they systematically move together. That's a correlation. Is there a predictable relationship between the two variables? Experiments are the only kind of research method that can actually establish causation. So remember, correlation is not causation, and that's because we can't establish directionality with a correlation. With an experiment, we have an independent variable that we manipulate or change, and then we see that after we change the independent variable, the dependent variable is what we measure to see what's the impact. It's that manipulation and the subsequent change in the dependent variable that helps to establish causation. The other part to an experiment is there's random assignment into experimental group or control group. And then the designs involve a time. Longitudinal, one group of kids, same age, bring them back over and over again over numerous times. That's a longitudinal design. A cross-sectional design is like a snapshot. You're just taking maybe many people of different ages in one point in time. That's a cross-sectional design. Cohort sequential design, on the other hand, you start off with many different ages and then you follow them over time. So it's kind of a combination of the two. Advantage to longitudinal, it's the only one that can really establish a developmental trajectory because you're looking at the same people over a long period of time. The con to it is that it is very expensive and you could lose people over time, whether they move or they just get bored or maybe they die. Those things can happen in longitudinal design. Cross-sectional design, the advantage is that it's quick and it's cheap, right? It's really easy to do a cross-sectional design. The problem is that you have to infer the changes, the differences between the stages. So because they're not the same people, you can't really say it's a developmental sequence with a cross-sectional design. And then cohort sequential design kind of combines the best of both worlds. So that is really my review for the exam. It is available already. And remember, you have 2 chances for the exam. So I recommend you start it early, and that way you have time before 11:59 p.m. To study and maybe ask questions if there are things that you're like, oh, I don't really understand this concept. So again, I will be available. I'll be monitoring my email. I want you to post any questions in the student forum because I'm sure other people have the same question. So if you email me individually and I think that your question is something that your peers would benefit from, I'm going to direct you to the student Q&A forum. And so I will be monitoring that throughout the day in case anybody has any questions. Remember that you have to have respondus installed so that you can have that, it'll be proctored. Any questions?
So you said we have 2 attempts to the exam?
You
Oh.
do?
Cool, awesome, thank you.
Yep, you're welcome. Now remember, you're all going to have slightly different exams because it's pulling from question banks, and the question bank has, I basically built a separate question bank for every topic on the study guide. And so the second time you get the exam, you likely won't have the same questions, but people still do better on the second time, even if they don't have exactly the same exam. I think part of it is that they're a little more calm, because first time you take it, you might be a little bit nervous. So generally, I do recommend you take it 2 times. Any other questions?
For the multiple choice portion, is
Okay.
that going to be graded immediately?
Yes, it will.
Okay. So
Whatever.
We'll
Go ahead.
be able to see our grade after the first like attempt. Right
For
away.
the multiple choice part, yes.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, so just remember that the grade you see will be out of 30 because 25 points will be multiple choice and 5 points will be matching, and those will be automatically graded. So the remaining 20 will be what I grade.
Quick
Any other
question.
Sure.
I noticed that it says that if we don't upload the cheat sheet, we get deducted points. So I checked on it and it says the page is not available.
What page is not available?
When you click the link that's connected to there, it says
Okay.
not available.
Okay, so I'll have to change that. The assignment is up, but I probably have it linked to a previous class, so I'll fix that. Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, good luck to everybody. Thank you for joining me, and I will post this when I get it. I'll post the unedited recording for everybody. Thank you so much for joining me this evening. Good luck on the exam.
Thank you,
Thank
Professor
you.
Edwards.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
You too.